You're listening to Crushing Club Marketing, a podcast for progressive club leaders looking to increase their club's revenue. Time for change begins right now. The private club industry continues to enjoy a resurgence, with waitlists becoming the norm in markets around the U.S. On top of that, experts predict the greatest generational wealth transfer in history, from boomers to Gen X and Millennials, by 2045. So, how will this new generation choose to spend their money and time? Frank Vane, CEO of the McMahon Group, joins me today and shares his perspective on the future of private clubs and what he believes will be critical to the continued success of private clubs in the future. Thanks for listening. So, Frank Vane has a unique perspective as the leader of the McMahon Group. He works with club leaders across the country, surveying members, creates long-range strategic plans for clubs, and provides us counsel, his advice, his experience to club leaders so that clubs can make the best decisions for their clubs. He has a pulse on the industry and a perspective on what clubs are doing and what they probably should be doing as they plan into the future. And generational experts will tell you that the values of Gen Xers, Gen Y, Gen Zers is totally different than the values of boomers. And they'll also explain to you how they measure their success or their status or credibility in totally different ways. So for boomers, where a country club was a totally, status type thing, it is not really the case necessarily for Gen X, Ys, and Zers. In fact, they're more concerned and more interested in experiential type of engagements than they are things like club membership. So the landscape of future club members is changing. And yet club leaders today, who are typically a little bit older, are trying to figure out how to balance keeping longtime members happy while attracting young, newer members, or new, younger members, if you will. There are so many factors in this balancing act to consider, and Frank and his team at the McMahon Group are helping to figure out what is right for each club, because as we all know, all clubs are different. So here's my conversation with Frank Vane. Well, Frank, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, boy, a lot to cover today in what you have called the golden age of clubs, or some variation. Sorry if I don't have that exactly right, but the golden age of clubs. I guess let's start there. When you talk about that, what does that mean?
Well, I think, it's a combination of things. I mean, in one way, it signifies that we're a little bit out of the wilderness in a way. Certainly, the financial, the Great Recession, 2009, 10, 11 were, pretty tough period, a very tough period for clubs. And they came back in sort of fits and starts after that. So you had really a good, 10 or 15 years there of some pretty challenging environment for most clubs. And then, and so the golden age and what I'm trying to signify in that is that while it is an industry that is subject to ups and downs over time, we've seen that in the past. I think there's more here. There's a combination of things happening that are more enduring, and so the golden age signifying that I think there's a convergence of sort of lifestyle. Really, a lot of that triggered by the pandemic was certainly a big part of it. There's innovation, whether spurred by the pandemic or other factors. Clubs have really changed quite a bit over the last several years. And then there's demographics. The demographics have turned in their favor, where particularly the millennials now are at the age where club membership makes social and financial sense for them. So that whole golden age is meant to say, yeah, well, things go up and down, and obviously if there's another major economic break like we saw in 2008, sort of all bets are off, but really that, that doesn't see any sign of that happening, and that with all these things converging at one time, it really ought to be something that lasts for quite a while. And I would say it's, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. You can look out there, and all these factors seem to be playing into their favor.
So maybe if we can put some of that in context within, as you started, you go back several years, and the industry was in a pretty constant decline up until the pandemic. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, really over the course, and I cite 2008 or 9 there, but really over the course of a good 20-year period of time, um, number of clubs declined. Number of golfers, if you're a club with golf, number of golfers in the U.S. declined for a long period of time, particularly among younger people. You certainly saw that. Number of clubs went out of business, about 20-25% of, and we're tending to follow what I would call the member-owned club. There are other quasi-commercial entities and semi-private kind of things that are in there. But when you think about the sort of the traditional member-owned club deal, their numbers were down. So yeah, I think by every metric, you could say it was like I say, they were out in the wilderness for quite a while.
Yeah. And then I've heard you say that the pandemic is the single best thing that has happened to private clubs. Is that, in what way was that?
It really, again, it's a bit of a combination of things, but I think at its core, it just it made evident their value. Why do I want to belong to a club? And so, whether it was for access to services otherwise difficult to come by, or sort of their personalized service, or dealing within a group of known parties, if you will, right? That all of a sudden smaller was better, more intimate, and privacy was better. People were nervous about sort of being out in the public. We were cautioned about that. So, a lot of that, just really exposed that, well, hey, a club is more than access to a golf course or a swimming pool or whatever. It's a community. It's a collective group of people. There's an approval process. There's a communications process, and a whole sense of community around that, where we were all searching for that, right, during COVID, as that was suddenly yanked away from us in many ways, and sort of cautioned about going outside or traveling on an airplane or going to a meeting or going to a restaurant. Clubs stood out as a bit of a beacon during that period. They said, well, I could still enjoy a lot of those things, but also do it in a way where I felt a little more comfortable, because even those members could have been susceptible to the same disease as everybody else was. There was just sort of a sense that you're a member, and a kind of that extension of family almost, as opposed to something where it's completely out there in the public.
In some ways, do you think the pandemic reintroduced people to private clubs maybe in a different way? I mean, if some of the stereotypes of private clubs and private club members for so long was especially if you're a golf club, was limited activity, but it seemed like through the pandemic, it brought families together and community together, like you're saying, in a way that was, in some ways, more fulfilling and enriching than it was before. Is that?
Well, I think that's right.
Fair?
I think it kind of, I think it kind of turned it on its head, right? You had, you've had kind of a political and social environment, again, over that same 20-year period, 2000 to 2020, where exclusivity was sort of judged a little more negatively, and all those things sort of, you were seen as not necessarily exclusive for exclusive access, but exclusionary, discriminatory, those sorts of negative connotations assigned to it. All of a sudden, it turned that on its head, because it said sort of, well, hey, I get it. I get why I would want to be part of a smaller group, and share values, share activities and experiences within that group. And so, as opposed to exclusivity being seen as this pejorative and you don't want me sort of thing. It was seen as, oh, that's a way to build a little network there and a group and thrive and grow even within a rather, a challenging environment that was going on around them. So yeah, I think it flipped that on its head and said, well, actually there's some value there to all that. And I get it. And, and you saw that because prior to that, it was often interesting. I mean, one, you had that negative perception about being in a club. And clubs, as they were struggling, often had this go, well, maybe it's too expensive. Maybe we should, do this or that. And all of a sudden, when it was more valued, the price went away. Initiation fees went up, dues went up, and all of those kinds of things. And so the value perception increased dramatically. And dollars and cents floated up with that, but it was really the sense of, okay, this is what I want from a group.
Yeah, and as someone who consults with private clubs, and I've heard you talk about this, but it's the innovation that occurred at the start of the pandemic. And I remember conversations that I was having with different people, and I was floored by how quickly clubs were putting things into motion. Whether it was a little igloos that were going up, especially in some of the north courses up north, or whatever they were, and the bureaucracy was gone. Things and they were innovating around family, and it was pretty remarkable. So now here we are at this point where it seems like people have been. I don't know if this is true or not, but it's almost like there's this renewed sense of value for your club and how much you can do and what you want to get out of it, matched with this golden age, this run now. And I'm reading some other things about the amount of generational wealth that's going to occur in the next several years, right? So there are going to be a lot of younger people with more, potentially more discretionary income that they can spend towards that. Are those all sort of the things that, like, as you were saying in the beginning, are those also factors as it relates to the next 8 to 10 years?
Well, I think so, as long as, and that's sort of as you turn to the future and say, and I think most of our clubs are saying right now, well, how do we keep it going, right? That's a good question that all club leaders should be asking. And I point out, and you're wise to mention that this whole notion of innovation, the notion that people wanted community and privacy during COVID. No, yeah, no, I get that, right? That's a pretty easy connection. They wanted outdoor recreation, so yeah, golf boomed, outdoor tennis boomed, all that. I think you could get there on those pretty quickly. I think the innovation piece of it often goes underreported, and yet it was the way that clubs responded, and it just shows, and it should be a good lesson for club leaders that a lot of those things you say happened overnight. Whether it was let's all of a sudden start Tuesday night tacos on the terrace or whatever, or building the igloos outside. There's a great little city club in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The Westmoreland Club had a courtyard next to it, primarily a dining club, and all of a sudden they pop these igloos out there, and people are out there in the courtyard having fun. I suspect if management had gone to the board, a couple months in advance of that and say, this winter we're going to try igloos outside and people are going to dine in them. That's an idea that dies at the boardroom table, I think,
Exactly.
So they were, they were ready to respond. And like anything, there's going to be some of those ideas will work and some of them won't work. But it was the fact that they were so willing to try, because in many ways they were scared to death. I think many of us, me included, at the beginning of COVID, it was my first reaction was, oh my gosh, here we go again. It's going to be another 2009 or 2010, and people aren't going to want to join clubs, and we're going to have another raft of closures and all that. And of course, after about a 3 to 4 month period of time where all that was incubating, the future turned out to be far different. But whether clubs just took snack bars and made them in the outdoor restaurants, or the igloos as we're mentioning, or put simulators, or there were clubs that took their old ballrooms because no more activities, no more group events, and they put simulators in the ballroom, and all of a sudden people are in there hitting golf balls and having fun. So
Right.
yeah, that carries through, and that is a big takeaway. Is that I think that's just a lesson that there ought to be you can't reinvent the club every year, but having a healthy dose of innovation in your in your business plan, in your strategic plan is extremely important.
Yeah. Let's talk about the who clubs are targeting, or maybe should be targeting in this golden age. What are you seeing, and what's your? Because I think for a long time they target guys that are. I'm in my late 50s, my age, maybe a little bit older. It's that's the target member, but it looks a little bit different today, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and and certainly a bit younger. I mean, again, you'll have the joining age versus, I think the average club member nationwide still mid 50s, as you're talking, 54, 55 is generally recognized as pretty much the profile of the average member. But the joiner is, tends to be about a 42-year-old couple, and a lot of joining happens age 35 to 45, and that's why we're very optimistic about about this being able to continue into a golden age. If we continue to innovate, we continue to have demand for things like golf and tennis and some of these recreational activities, health and wellness. But the addressable market, so to speak, is expanding. The millennials just now, the oldest, where the clock ever starts ticking in these demographic things. But if you just say 1980, right, then the oldest millennial right now is 42, 43 years old. So they're getting right there, and there's a whole cohort of 80 million people behind them that suggest over the next decade the number of people in their early 40s is on the increase. And so, you just look at lifestyle in general, right? Look at what's happening out there in, housing, right? All the demand for housing today, and schools that go along with that. You look at equity markets and the resilience and the amount of investment and capital flow that's happening there. Those all happen around a period of time where the middle age group is expanding. You can almost transport a lot of what's happening in the club world today back to the mid 90s, which was another good boom period for the clubs. And guess what? The baby boomers were in the same position there, at that point as millennials are now. And so, so clubs should be thinking about that group and thinking about that. That they're ready to, they were very urban a decade ago. Our cities were booming, and people wanted to live downtown, and we saw a good renaissance in the American city. We're having a similar uptake now in the American suburbs, where those millennials who were 40, 42 years old had some kids now. They got married a little later, got married in their early 30s or so. Now they've got some 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds, and they're ready to move to the suburbs, get to where the schools are, the houses with space, and all those things that they need. And guess what? They need a club to help socialize in, get ingrained in the community, meet other people, meet other young families, or have outlets at those clubs where the kids are on the swim team, or they're playing junior golf, or just the family can go there for holiday brunches and those sorts of things. It's just right in their sweet spot. And so yeah, I clubs ought to be targeting on, and we think of it in a couple of ways. You get the 65 and over group, you're pretty set in your way at the club. You get that mid-age group, and they've got money and time. They're using the club quite actively. More golf play is played and things like that. And then you have the young family, that's sort of 45 and under or so. But that's the future, right? The older group is naturally attrition. They move to Florida. I mean, obviously the biggest thing is people get sick, they pass away, whatever, they need to be replaced. And so that young group in that early 40s is ready to come in and replace them. And I think you've got a lot of people there if we're offering the right things that they're looking for.
Right. And I think that, and hence I think the crux of the conversation, because, so many, you hear generational experts talk about country clubs don't mean the same thing to this younger generation that it meant to, say, the boomers. And there are so many things they're interested in, whether it's travel or just other activities, experiential things with their families, right? That you hear generational experts talk about. So given all that, while there is this population that, this market, if you will, that's potentially available or that clubs can go after, what do clubs need to do differently, in your opinion? Is it relates to amenities, messaging, how clubs position themselves and the experiences they offer these 42-year-olds?
Sure, sure. Well, I think the big one to really think about is their approach to family. Is I've often really said that the young members coming to the club today are bringing their children with them. But the punchline for all that is that they expect you, the club, to be actively programming and in ways kind of taking care of those kids while they're on campus. I think historically, you go back to the boomers and even prior to that, children came to the club and it was almost a sort of it could be seen and not heard sort of approach, right? And if you took your kids to dinner at the club, they were going to sit at the table, and you were going to figure out how to keep them under control that whole time while they
For
were
sure.
sitting at the table, and making sure they weren't upsetting the apple cart and the decorum of the dining room or the club in general. They might have even come in with their little blazer on, right, to come in and sit at dinner with you. Today's young family says, well, we're coming to the club, we're going to have dinner. The kids probably are going to get a little rambunctious. Are you going to show them a movie down the hall, and they're going to be able to go to the game room, or you're going to do something for them, of course, aren't you? While
Right.
I'm having dinner, and they really have a hard time understanding why you wouldn't be doing that. And frankly, it's not all that complex. It's not all that difficult to do. We typically have a lot of space and all that, but it's about programming to ease that. Again, these families are busy. Probably both adults. The likelihood that both adults are working is very, very high.
Mm-hmm.
So they're crunched for free time, so to speak. And so if the club is seen as, again, that refuge, they may want to be with the kids and doing something, but they also want to know that the family is there at the club and participating either jointly or separately in these kinds of activities. And so, I think as the club looks to satisfy that group, really recognizing that the children are, vitally important in that whole equation, and the kids aren't coming to the club to be disciplined or to be told to, sort of sit down and be quiet. They want them in, they want them to learn something. They want to make sure that the junior golf or the junior tennis or whatever programs, there's real instruction there. There's real training that goes along with that. I mean, I remember junior golf, right, was the mom and dads would walk along the golf course with the kids, and you just sort of made sure that nobody got hit in the head with a golf club. Was kind of what junior golf was all about. Today, people want their junior golf to be, there's instruction there and things that go along with that, and so at all levels, it's really programming across the spectrum there. And with for this group in particular, a real high priority on that the families are welcome. Kids have spaces that they can enjoy. Pool locker rooms are it's no longer acceptable to have these kind of, industrial strength pool locker rooms, but something that's kind of attractive, the food and that sort of thing that you're serving them, all those things really saying that the family is really, in the wheelhouse, really part of our mix. And you've thought about that in all aspects of physical facility and most importantly, programming so that there's engagement.
The idea of having a club that's more family friendly, for lack of a better term, it seems like you'd have a lot of club leaders that would agree with that and say, "Oh yeah, for sure." But it's how they get from where they are to that. In some cases, that matched with the fact that I mean, you talk to more people than I do, I'm sure, in the space. However, it seems like there are a lot of clubs that are making capital improvements. And And I know many clubs, the decision might be around something focused on whether it's a golf course and what we're doing with the golf course versus, geez, should we spend more money to update our dining services, to expand more family areas? What are you seeing out there as far as, where clubs are investing?
Yeah, well, you're correct in our opinion. I mean, and again, the core of McMahon's business as we got into the club space 40 years ago was actually an outgrowth from an architectural company, and with really a focus that said it was going to go around the country and do clubhouse architecture, and a lot of in a lot of ways that's still a big driver in our business, but again, it's the strategy and the concepts that go behind that. But over all that period of time, we've been involved in a couple $1 billion worth of capital projects, and yeah, you've seen few periods, if any, frankly, where there's been more capital spent. Number of clubs, as well as the size of what clubs are doing. It's the number of clubs. We all read the periodicals, and we certainly experience it firsthand that clubs doing 20, 25, $30 million projects, values that are unheard of, and there's obviously some inflation in that, but it's also the scope and the reinvention and the things that they're doing. So yeah, they're spending a lot of money, and really across the board. I'd say first and foremost, it is the reinvention of the food and beverage outlets, all of that the people don't want stuffy, and so the formal traditional dining room of the past and all that, they want that same sort of feel that they get when they go to the new hip place downtown. So indoor, outdoor, the sliding nano walls, the outside sitting areas, the fire pits, the radiant heat, so that we can sit outside in a room that's, we're not just dining on the terrace. The terrace has actually been reinvented to be an outside dining room.
Right.
That sort of thing. Certainly, the bar areas that clubs are putting in. That again, and the bar itself is, probably many members like a good drink, but the beauty of the bar room and these, I'll say these pubs and such the clubs are building, it's a space that you can just walk into by yourself and just see who's there. I'm going to I wonder if Ed's at the club tonight or whatever, whoever, just walk in that room, as opposed to walking in a dining room and everybody's looking at you and it's just you and somebody else or whatever. It's a communal thing and a place to meet. So, and I think the upshot of that also that we always say is, right, everybody eats, right? So, you can affect the most members, the hardcore golfer to, the social member who, is just there for dining. All of them and their spouses and their families all have the ability and the interest in using the food and beverage facilities. So I think that's been the, probably the top reinvention area that you've seen. But that continues right on down the line. There's a lot of stuff going on in the golf world. I mean, we think of golf as, make the course the best we can make it. And frankly, the data would often show that, clubs may overspend on the course itself. But today, a lot of money is going into the practice facilities, the simulators, the golf learning areas, the putting courses, the short game areas, Top Golf, and other features, other facilities have shown us there's multiple ways to enjoy golf. And so, again, if you're going to be great in golf today, you've got to have a golf performance center. And why would your members go to, I won't name any names, but why would they go to, so-and-so sporting goods to get fitted for their clubs? They need to be doing that at your club, right? That's why they join the club. And if the club wants to be cutting edge, it ought to have a fitting room. It ought to have, simulators, not only for fun, but for training, or a short game area and all that. And, modern golfers have seen that. So, in almost all our activities, you can talk about swimming, right?
Sure.
Swimming used to be a swimming pool was a box of water with a concrete deck around it, and there were some lounge chairs, and there was a snack bar where you could get a hamburger or a hot dog, and that was sort of the fine of the day. That was what people felt was there. Today, the whole vernacular around the resort style pool complex, and there's spray grounds or slides or shade structures, upgraded food and beverage, and the water is about the same. You just need a good place to take a dip, but the environment around that is completely different than
Yeah.
what we had in the past.
What's the biggest objection you hear from club leaders when you advise them to do what they can to make their club more family friendly?
Well, I they it's the leadership in clubs, like a lot of ultimately it's a bit of a political and activity, if you will, and politics generally skews to the to the elder demographic, right? Again, people who have time, they want to give back, they're well-meaning, but you've got a lot more time to serve on a club board if you're in your 60s than when you're in your 40s.
Right.
But again, unfortunately, there's a big disconnect between what the 60-year-old may be thinking and what the 40-year-old really wants to buy. And that's not to criticize. I'm certainly well above that myself. And it's not all folks in that age group means that they're resistant to change or opposed to it, but I think it's often hard for them to really appreciate it, right? And to really, truly sense that demand, and always have a level of skepticism that says, well, is it really worth the money? Should we make that expenditure, et cetera? So it's tough for them to, walk in the shoes of that young group, and there's often a sense that, well, they'll either take what we've always offered, or they're not willing to pay up for what it would take to have these kinds of services. And the reality is often very different. Again, if it's for their family, the millennials are often willing to pay for that. The millennials, on an inflation adjusted basis, the 40-year-olds who are out there today make more money than the 40-year-old baby boomer did. So they are in a good financial position, and are generally proving willing to spend it on their club. But I think it's that generational divide, and it's often unfortunately to make those investments, everybody in the club's probably going to have to pay up in one way or another, right? So
Right.
again, getting that older member to say, yeah, we ought to expand the fitness facility, we ought to renovate the pool complex, and by the way, you're going to get a dues increase, or a capital fee or an assessment to make those happen. And that's why it's important in any capital plan to look across those age groups. You can't just go in one direction and say, okay, we're going to focus all our energy and focus all that on the pool. You're doing that pool, you ought to be giving the golfers something at the same time, and doing something in dining, whatever. You tend to want to spread that around a little bit, so each of the age groupings can look at it and think that they're going to get feel they're going to get some real value out of it.
Right. There's the politics of it all, as you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, what happens next? I mean, some clubs are going to adapt and change. Some clubs may not, and obviously painting with really broad strokes here, because some clubs are, not all clubs are the same, right? And different clubs have different ability to do things and needs. But generally speaking, what is your thought as far as how this plays out as we move forward with the golden age?
Yeah, well, it's certainly been an environment where the rich have gotten richer, so to speak, to use an analogy. Those clubs that can put up the capital have furthered themselves from the rest of the marketplace, and even put themselves in even stronger positions than they were in previously, which again can eat up eat up the demand in the marketplace. Some of them have created capacity, and that allows them to expand their membership a little bit and things like that. Said the other way, right now, if your club is not doing very well in this environment, I'd be really concerned. The club today that not why well we believe, and data suggests that more than half the clubs in the country have a waiting list today. So if you're in that other half, and you're not close, well then you've got some real concerns, and it is time to shake it up a little bit and see that, put what innovation can you put in there and how can you rally to do things. I think in a lot of ways it's, we see those big projects as we're talking about, but things can be scaled. And that's, again, what we were talking about earlier about the innovation period. Um, I have a client that comes to mind, Manor Country Club outside the Baltimore area. They had a snack bar area that was, the golfers made the turn there. They put some money in that. They put some, shade structures outside of it, bought some new furniture. This was not a big expense. And all of a sudden they had a really valued casual outside area on a lawn where people could just come and chill, and they were able to put a little money in the cooking equipment and picked up expanded that menu somewhat. So this was not a $1 million rebuild of the snack bar. It was taking an existing facility, and if they spent $50,000-$75,000 on that, but they got to where they needed to get to for that. So I think a lot of times, there's a thought, well, we need to blow the whole place up. It's often very valuable to incubate programs and move ahead with at least get your toe in the water and start to do things. And I think the smaller clubs can do that. The trends are probably going to be the same across those demographic groups. How much you can do at each club will be determined by the market location and the support of the overall financial wherewithal of that community. But society is moving in the same direction, and I think the goalposts are the same. You just have to figure out how much of that you can bite off at any one time.
Yeah, you talk about the clubs that are not maybe the clubs that don't have waiting lists, the clubs that maybe aren't doing real well. Obviously, change is something that, they might as well think about it, right? Let's do some things different, shake it up. What about the clubs that are doing well that that are sitting on their hands? Is there a risk in being cocky at this time?
Well,
I say cocky, but you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'd say, it's funny. I had an experience when I, sort of first in the club industry. We'd go and sort of make a sales call, for lack of a better term, and a lot of times we find ourselves in the metropolitan New York area, and you'd go into a club and it might have had a pretty famous sort of brand. Before you showed up, you had a perception of, well, this is really a special place. And you got there and you looked around and you're like, wow, this is not all that impressive on the surface here. And then you talk to some of the club leaders and everything else, and they're like, well, it's fine, we're full, so why do we need to do anything? We're doing great, So and so that was just instructive for me that resting on your laurels or sitting back and saying, yeah, it's fine. That's not going to be a valued club or a valued membership down the line. You certainly see that in the Florida market today, where some new and innovative and big clubs have come on. Some of these clubs have spent, talk about clubs spending 30, 40, $50 million. All of a sudden, some of the older clubs in some of those marketplaces, you can go on the west side of Florida right now and find some folks that were the market leaders, a decade or so ago. And right now they can look down the street and find that, boy, brand X is all of a sudden really got a lot going on over there, So, yeah, I think in any business, leaders need to be thinking out that 5 or 10 years and challenging. Sometimes that's harder, for a conversation a moment ago, we always say, it depends on how much pain the club is in, right? In any business, if you're staring at, solvency or viability, you'll probably at some point say, okay, let's try that because this isn't working. You have to guard against that notion that we're there, right? We're done. It's and you see that a lot of clubs. Clubs tend to approach both strategic planning and capital planning in an episodic way that says, okay, we're going to do a strategic plan and we're going to check that box and it's done. Or we're going to do a capital plan and we're going to go out and we're going to spend a lot of money here in 2025 and that's going to be done. And we're never going to have a capital program again, or right. Almost that's inferred or assumed or sometimes even used as the language of selling the program is, well, we haven't done anything for a decade, or 2 decades, so we're going to do this and then we're done. What we're really trying to get clubs to realize is it's much more of a flywheel approach. You're going to put some investments in. You're going to create some new programs. You're going to have some new activity. Hopefully, that's generating some new membership and new interest. But then you go back to the beginning again, and you do your research to find out internally and externally, what do people want? Are we providing it, or what's next for us that you could continue to do and to push the thing forward? And so then that can, like I say, sometimes that can be a tougher, sort of sell, or a tougher mission, because everybody else is just sort of sitting there saying, well, it's fine, gosh, we're full, we got a waiting list, this is just great. Well, on the facility side, facilities are always in some state of challenge. They're aging, and so there's some level of deterioration, and getting enough capital to either maintain or improve is always a battle. So they might sit on their hands relative to that, where if they could take that in a more consistent way and manage their resources, work under the concept of a long range plan, and always be looking ahead, that's what the great clubs can do. It's what any great organization can do.
Yeah, awesome. Frank, thanks so much for your time and for your thoughts on this. And thank you for listening. If you find the content from this episode to be helpful, subscribe to Crushing Club Marketing wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, keep crushing your club marketing.